The boot print in the mud was still filling with ice melt, which meant she was only 10 minutes behind him. That simple fact, that timeline, tasted like stolen copper in Audrey's mouth. It was Tuesday, October 17th, and the sky above the high Lonesome Pass had turned the color of a fresh bruise. Just a few hours ago, she'd been celebrating. The 7-day solo trek through the Colorado Rockies was her victory lap. Her proof that after the quiet wreckage of her divorce, she was still whole. She'd packed her own gear, studied her own maps. She was Audrey Reynolds, 34 years old, and she was fine. Totally fine. But now, the wind was a living thing, screamed down from the peaks, slinging needles of freezing rain against the hood of her bright blue rain jacket. T-rail. The trail beneath her boots, a path marked so clearly on her laminated map, had become a slippery, terrifying scramble over loose shale. Her hiking poles, which had felt so confident this morning, now trembled with every planted step. Ahead, maybe 50 feet through the swirling white, a shape moved. It was the cowboy. She'd seen him that morning at the Sunrise Creek trailhead, a solitary figure loading a dun-colored horse with an ease that spoke of 1,000 mornings just like it. He wore a heavy oilskin slicker, dark and slick with wet, and a worn brown hat. As Audrey had nervously tightened the straps on her brand-new backpack, she'd overheard a local in a red truck, a man delivering supplies to the trailhead outhouse, offer a low warning to a pair of hikers. "You folks, see that fella there? Name's Granger. Keep your distance. He's bad news around here." The hikers had glanced over, shrugged, and headed off on a different trail. Audrey had stored the comment away like a curious stone in her pocket, more focused on her own journey. Now, that stone felt heavy. Because when the storm hit with shocking fury just past noon, and when the trail forked at the confusing signpost for Lost Miners Gulch, her map had disintegrated into a pulpy mess in her hands. Doreen had found the zipper on her map case, thin. In that moment of cold panic, staring at two identical-looking paths disappearing into the fog, she'd seen his tracks, clear, sharp boot prints, and the steady cloven marks of a shod horse. They went left, too. It was a decision made not with logic, but with the raw instinct to follow any sign of another human. She had chosen the devil she didn't know over the wilderness that suddenly felt vast and hungry. So she followed. For over an hour, she followed those tracks, the only solid things in a world dissolving into gray and white. She kept him in sight, a dark anchor in the storm. T never looked back. He just moved, steady and silent, his horse plodding beside him, too. The silence from him was worse than if he'd shouted. It filled the space with every bad story she'd ever heard about lonely mountain roads and strangers. Audrey's mind raced, playing a terrible game of ping pong. Just a local. He knows the way out. Then, bad news. The man said bad news. Her fingers inside her gloves were numb. Her nose was running, and she wiped it on her soggy sleeve. A small, miserable action. Shoo. Tried to remember the last normal moment. It was just this morning, sitting on the tailgate of her Subaru, lacing up her boots, feeling the warm sun on her neck. She'd eaten an apple, crisp and sweet, and watched a chipmunk dart between the pine cones. That felt like a memory from someone else's life. The trail narrowed, squeezed between a wall of jagged granite and a terrifying drop. The sound of the wind was different, higher, keening whine as it funneled through the stone corridor. She'd kept her eyes glued to the cowboy's back, to the sway of his slicker. Then he stopped. He didn't turn. Shoo. Just stood there, his head slightly cocked, as if listening to something beneath the wind's roar. Audrey froze, 10 paces behind. What was he hearing? Her own breath sounded ragged in her ears. Shilz's, tense. And then, it came. A sound like a gunshot, sharp and final, cracked the sky. But it wasn't from the sky. Came from the cliff face above and behind her. A deep, groaning snap. Pull. Before she could even process it, the mountain itself seemed to shudder, too. The ground beneath her boots vibrated. Skint took over. She threw herself forward, pressing her body flat against the cold, wet granite of the cliff wall, squeezing her eyes shut. The world erupted in noise. A thunderous, rolling roar that swallowed the wind whole. The air filled with a stinging, choking cloud of dust and shattered stone. She felt impacts, small rocks pelting her backpack and legs, like hailstones. The noise seemed to go on forever, a terrifying avalanche of sound. She clutched at the rock, her fingers finding tiny crevices, holding on for her life. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Alas! Few pebbles clattered down. An eerie, ringing silence descended, broken only by the returning softer whine of the wind. Audrey slowly, painfully, pushed herself away from the wall. She turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. The trail behind her was gone. Where just moments ago there had been a path, there was a chaotic, fresh slope of broken boulders and rubble, stretching from the cliff edge down into the misty void of the gulch. The way back had vanished, buried under tons of mountain. The hairline fracture in her reality, that small choice to follow a stranger, had just split wide open. She was trapped. A low voice cut through the silence, making her jump. It was the first word she'd heard him speak. Don't look back. She turned her head. Granger had finally looked at her. Space was in shadow under the brim of his hat, but she could see the sharp line of his jaw. Tyke wasn't looking at the rockfall. He was looking at her, his gaze intense and unsettling. He nodded ahead, up the trail. Shelters, this way, can't stay here. He didn't wait for an answer, simply turned and started walking, leading his horse. Audrey stood there, stunned, her body trembling not just from the cold. She looked at the impassable wall of rock. She looked at the retreating figure of the cowboy. Her digital watch, the one her sister gave her for this trip, was beeping weakly under her sleeve. She pulled the cuff back. The screen was fogged, but she could make out the time, 2:17 p.m. She had hours until dark, but the cold was already a deep, aching presence in her bones. She had no map, no way back. With a shuddering breath that felt like her first, she took a step, then another. Her boots, caked in mud, followed the deep, clear prints left by his. She was committed. Now, the only path forward was following a man branded bad news into the heart of the storm. The unspoken question hung in the frozen air, heavier than her pack. What, exactly, was she walking into? For a long time, Audrey couldn't feel her hands. A whiz in the cold. Not entirely. Words, the leftover adrenaline, the crash after the mountain fell apart. Her body felt like a wire that had been pulled too tight, and then suddenly cut loose. Every step was a shaky negotiation with the slick rock. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps that burned her throat, raw from the thin, screaming air. At nearly 12,000 feet ahead, Granger moved with a rhythm that made no sense in this chaos. He didn't stumble, didn't pause to check his footing. He and his horse moved as a single, dark unit through the blinding white, like they were part of the storm itself. The horse, a sturdy animal with a calm, plodding gait, seemed to trust him completely. That trust felt like a luxury Audrey couldn't afford. She focused on the man's back, on the way his oilskin slickers shed the sleet in sheets. It was the only thing to focus on. Devoured. The world had narrowed to this. The sting of ice on her cheeks. The heavy, wet smell of soaked wool from her own gloves. And a dark shape of a stranger, leading her deeper into the white. They weren't on the main trail anymore. She knew that with a sinking certainty. The wide, well-marked path was buried under the rock. Granger had led them onto a narrow game trail, a scratch in the mountainside that seemed to cling to the cliff by sheer stubbornness. To her right was the rock wall, cold and unyielding. To her left, just a few feet away, the ground dropped away into a foggy nothingness. The wind here had a different sound, a lonely, hollow whistle that made her teeth ache. Her mind was a messy, frightened scramble. One part replayed, the rockfall in a jarring loop, the crack, the shudder, the roaring darkness. 2. Another part, the part that had planned this trip for 6 months on color-coded spreadsheets, screamed that this was all wrong. You left the marked trail. Broke the #1 rule. Followed a strange man. The two thoughts collided, leaving her dizzy and nauseous. After what felt like an hour of this silent, terrifying procession, Granger stopped. He held up a closed fist, a simple, clear signal. Audrey her heart leaping into her throat. Was someone else out here? Stood perfectly still, head tilted again, listening to. The only sound was the endless wind and the soft snort of his horse. Then he pointed. Ahead, the game trail seemed to dead-end into a solid wall of granite. But as she squinted, her eyes watering from the cold, she saw it. A narrow vertical crack in the cliff face. It was barely wider than his shoulders, a jagged, black seam in the grey stone. He turned to look at her then, and for the first time, she saw his face clearly. He wasn't old, maybe in his late 40s, but his skin was weathered and lined, tanned deep by a lifetime of sun. His eyes were a pale, startling blue, like the winter sky just before a blizzard day. There was no malice in them, but no warmth either, just a flat, practical assessment. "Shelter's through there," he said, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the wind. "It's that, or we try to wait out the snow sitting on this ledge." He wasn't asking, he was stating a fact. And Audrey, with her numb fingers and the deep, penetrating chill that had settled into the very center of her bones, knew he was right. Be waiting. Here was a slow, passive surrender to the cold. Her expensive, weather-rated sleeping bag was in her pack. But pitching her tiny tent on this exposed sliver of rock was impossible. This was the moment. The irreversible choice. Stepping off the marked trail had been one thing. Stepping into that dark, unknown crack in the mountain, a place that existed on no map she'd ever seen, was something else entirely. It felt like stepping off the edge of the world. Shoo looked at the crack. Shoo looked at the vast white emptiness behind her. Shoo looked at Granger's waiting, impassive face. She gave a single, stiff nod without a word. He turned and squeezed into the fissure, his horse following with a surprising, gentle nudge from his hand. The animals' sides brushed the stone with a soft, grating sound, too. And then they were swallowed by the darkness. Audrey was alone on the ledge. Derwin pushed at her back, as if urging her forward. Shoo took a deep, shuddering breath that tasted of stone and ice, and followed. Inside, the world changed. The scream of the wind vanished, replaced by a damp, echoing silence. The only light was a faint grey glow from the entrance behind her, and the beam of Granger's flashlight ahead. The air was cold, but it was a still cold, not a biting one. It smelled of wet earth and old, undisturbed things. The passage wasn't long. Spell. After about 20 paces of squeezing through the cool, narrow stone, it opened up. Granger's flashlight beam swept across a small, rough space. It wasn't a cave. Not really. It was an old miner's shack, built right into the hollow of the mountain. 3 walls were stacked, rough-hewn logs, chinked with crumbling mortar. 4 was the living rock of the mountain itself. He moved inside, his light revealing details that sent a fresh, different kind of chill through Audrey. This wasn't an abandoned hideaway, stumbled upon by chance. A small Castian stove sat in one corner, a pile of split, dry wood stacked neatly beside it. A simple cot, with a faded blue blanket, was pushed against the rock wall. On a crude wooden shelf were cans of beans, tomatoes and peaches, their labels dusty but intact. And on the wall, pinned up with simple nails, were maps, topographical maps of the high lonesome region, but covered in handwritten notes and routes drawn in precise red ink. This was someone's place, a deliberate, prepared retreat. "You can get those wet things off by the stove," Granger said, his voice echoing slightly in the small space. He was already unbuckling gear from his horse, his movements efficient. He didn't seem alarmed or surprised by this place. Scuba longed here. Daughtry moved stiffly toward the stove, her limbs protesting. She shrugged off her soaking backpack with a groan of relief, then peeled off her dripping jacket. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely unlace her boots. As she worked, her eyes kept darting around the room, taking in the evidence of a solitary life. Then, her gaze landed on the small shelf above the cot. Next to a tin cup and a box of matches was a single framed photograph. The light from the flashlight and the growing glow from the stove Granger was now lighting fell on it. Audrey's breath caught. The woman in the photo was smiling, her hair blown by some unseen wind. Shoo was standing on a rocky summit, arms outstretched. Shoes, maybe a few years younger than Audrey, and she looked familiar. The shape of her smile. The The way she held her head was looking at a faded, happier version of her own college photos. A deep, quiet dread began to pool in Audrey's stomach. This wasn't just a shelter, it was a shrine. Granger got the fire going, the dry wood catching quickly with a cheerful crackle that felt utterly wrong for the moment. Orange light danced over the walls, making the shadows jump. Stood up, dusting his hands on his jeans, and followed her gaze to the photograph. His face, in the flickering light, seemed to soften for a fraction of a second, then went blank again. He didn't explain, he didn't say who she was, just looked at the picture. Then at Audrey, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. The silence in the shack grew thick and heavy, filled only by the popping of the pine logs. Finally, he spoke, his voice so low it was almost part of the fire's murmur. She didn't make it out either. Then he turned away, busying himself with filling a small kettle from a water canister. If he hadn't just dropped those words into the quiet like stones into a still pond, Audrey stood frozen by the growing warmth of the stove, her socks damp on the dirt floor. The howl of the wind outside had completely died. A deep, snow-muffled silence had wrapped itself around the hidden shack, marking the passage from a terrifying afternoon into an uncertain, eerie night. The immediate danger was gone, she was out of the storm, but as she stared at the smiling face of the woman who looked so much like her, a new and more terrifying question settled in the warm air. Just what kind of shelter had she walked into?
Warmth, it turned out, could be just as frightening as the cold. The little stove glowed cherry red in the corner of the shack, pushing back the deep chill of the mountain night. But for Audrey, hunched on the edge of the cot wrapped in a scratchy wool blanket Granger had wordlessly offered, the heat did nothing to thaw the ice forming in her chest. The silence was the worst part. After the scream of the wind, this quiet felt heavy and watchful, broken only by the pop of the fire and the slow, steady sound of Granger cleaning his gear by the door. He had made her a cup of tea, strong and bitter, using water from his canister and a tea bag from a dusty box. He'd opened a can of peaches, handing her one half with a spoon. His actions were practical, even kind in a distant way. But his eyes, those pale blue eyes, kept flicking to her, then to the photograph on the shelf, then back. Every time, a tiny muscle in his jaw would tighten. He'd spoken only a handful of words since his chilling statement about the woman in the picture. Eat, drink, storms settling in. Each one felt like a stone dropped into the well of silence between them. Outside, the world had gone utterly black and still. The storm had blown itself out, leaving a freezing, crystalline quiet in its wake. Through the small, grimy window, Audrey could see a sprinkle of stars against a velvet sky. It was beautiful in a way that felt cruel. So much peace, just on the other side of the log wall. While inside, her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The woman in the photo, she didn't make it out either. The words echoed. Either that meant someone else hadn't made it out. Who? Him. Was he saying he was trapped here, too? Or was it a warning? As the night deepened, Garden's calm began to fray at the edges. He finished with his gear, but instead of settling down, he started to pace. Not inside the cramped shack, but outside, in the narrow space between the shack wall and the cliff face. Audrey could hear his boots on the frozen ground crunch, pause, crunch, and then, a low murmur. He was talking, not to her, to his horse, maybe, or to himself. She crept closer to the window. The rough wool of the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. She peered through the dirty glass. In the starlight, she could see his silhouette, a solid black cutout against the snow. He was standing by the horse, his head bent close to the animal's neck. His voice was a soft, steady rumble. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a soothing tone, the kind you'd use to calm a frightened child. Who was he trying to calm? She backed away from the window, her breath fogging the cold glass. The shack, which had felt like a sanctuary an hour ago, now felt like a beautifully set trap. The bedroll, the food, the maps, they weren't for unexpected hikers. They were for him. This was his place. And she was here, looking like a ghost from his past. Sleeping in that ghost's bed. Her reflection in the dark window pane caught her eye. A pale, smudged face, with wide, frightened eyes stared back. This wasn't the woman who had triumphantly packed her car 3 days ago. That woman had a plan. That woman had spreadsheets and energy bars and a hopeful heart. The woman in the reflection had none of that. She was just a pair of scared eyes in the dark, waiting to see what would happen to her. She had traded the active danger of the storm for the passive terror of waiting. She had become a victim in her own story, and the realization tasted like Ashdod. Her gaze dropped to the shelf near the stove. Among the cans and the matches, something metallic caught the firelight. It was a knife, an old, bone-handled hunting knife, its leather sheath worn smooth. It lay there casually, like just another tool. A terrible, clear thought cut through the fog of her fear. It was an impossible choice, the kind you only read about. The knife was maybe 10 feet away. Granger was outside, pacing. She could take it, hide it in the folds of the blanket. For what? Protection. A threat. The man had given her shelter, food, and warmth. He had also led her to a shrine of a missing woman who shared her face. Was he her savior, or was he something else? Something the man in the red truck had sensed but couldn't name. If she took the knife, she changed everything. She turned a silent understanding into a potential fight. If she didn't take it, she was placing her life completely in the hands of a stranger whose grief or guilt or loneliness was a mystery to her. Her fingers curled into the blanket. Her palms were slick with sweat. The pacing outside stopped. The silence that followed was thicker than before. She heard the soft creak of the shack's crude wooden door. He was coming back in. Acting on an instinct older than reason, Audrey moved. She didn't go for the knife. Instead, she quickly lay down on the cot, turning her back to the door. Pulling the blanket up to her chin, she forced her breathing to slow, pretending to be asleep. The door opened, letting in a slash of freezing air that made the fire flicker. She felt him stand there, a presence filling the small space. She could feel his eyes on her back. The seconds stretched out, long and thin as wire. Then, she heard the soft sound of him sitting down on the dirt floor, his back against the wall opposite the cot. A long sigh escaped him, a sound of profound tiredness. Hours crept by. Audrey didn't sleep. She watched the firelight dance on the log wall in front of her, her ears straining for every sound. The deep, ancient cold of the mountains seeped into the shack as the fire burned down to embers. This was the deepest, darkest point of the night, the hour when the world feels forgotten and hope seems like a story you were told as a child. Lying perfectly still, staring at the fading glow on the wall, she finally understood. The local's warning hadn't been a lie, but she had misunderstood it completely. It wasn't that Granger himself was bad news. She whispered the realization into the fabric of the blanket, her voice so quiet it was just a shape on her lips. It wasn't the mountain. Bad news wasn't a person. It was a situation, a tragedy. And whatever that tragedy was, it had happened out here, in these mountains. It had involved the woman in the photo. And now, she was caught in the same lonely, snow-covered landscape with the man it had happened to. The storm had passed, but a different kind of chill was settling in, one that asked a new and even more urgent question. If the real danger wasn't the man or the mountain, then what was it that had kept the woman from making it out? The first, faint light of dawn didn't bring color. It brought shape. Gray shapes of logs, the black shape of the stove, the soft lump that was Granger, still sleeping sitting up against the wall. Audrey hadn't slept at all. Her entire body was stiff, a statue carved from worry and cold. But her mind, after that long, dark night, was painfully, sharply clear. She had always been a planner. That was her flaw and her strength. She planned grocery lists, vacation itineraries, 5-year life goals. When the divorce papers came, she'd made a spreadsheet for that, to assets, emotions, future steps. Planning was her way of controlling a chaotic world. Out here, her plans had turned to pulp in the rain. But maybe, she thought, watching the slow rise and fall of Granger's shoulders, chaos could be a tool, too. If she couldn't plan her way out, she could quietly, carefully, unsettle the situation until a new path revealed itself. She moved silently, like a shadow detaching from the wall. Her first act wasn't grand. It was small and deliberate. As she pretended to stir and build up the fire, she took the tin cup she'd used for tea. She scooped a fine handful of cold ashes from the edge of the stove's hearth. She tipped them into Granger's open canteen, which sat near his saddlebags. She swirled it gently, watching the ashes dissolve into the water, turning it a cloudy, unappealing gray. It wouldn't hurt him. It would just be gritty and strange, one more small, off-kilter thing in his morning. Next, her eyes landed on his compass. It was a beautiful, brass old thing, attached to a leather cord beside his maps on the wall. While he slept on, his breathing deep and even, she crept over. Her fingers, cold and clumsy, fumbled with the clasp. She didn't steal it. That would be too obvious. Instead, she simply turned it just a few degrees, so that the needle no longer pointed to the painted end, but sat slightly askew. A subtle wrongness, The kind of thing that would nag at a man who knew these mountains by heart, making him second-guess his own instincts. The final piece was the most dangerous. She had to use the one thing she had that she never wanted, her resemblance to the woman in the photograph. As the shack grew brighter and Granger began to stir, she made her voice soft, confused. She stood by the shelf, looking at the picture. "She looks so happy here," Audrey said, not looking at him. Was this on the day she didn't make it out? Granger, who was rubbing sleep from his face, froze. His eyes snapped to her, then to the photo. A flash of pain, raw and deep, crossed his features before he shuddered it away. "No," he said, his voice gravelly. "That was earlier. A happier time." "It must have been sudden," Audrey continued, turning to face him, letting the morning light fall on her face. "The accident, I mean. Was she caught in a storm, too?" He flinched as if she'd struck him. He looked from her face to the photo and back, a confusion in his eyes that was almost like fear. It wasn't an accident like that," he muttered, turning away to fuss with his gear. Her innocent questions were like stones tossed into the still pond of his grief. And she watched the ripples of unease spread across him. He was becoming untethered, looking at her not as a person to help, but as a painful echo. Her actions were small, but she saw their effect. When he took a drink from his canteen later, he spat the gritty water out with a grimace, staring at the canteen as if it had betrayed him. He checked his compass twice, frowning, tapping the glass. He was jumpy, his calm demeanor replaced by a watchful tension, but she noticed something crucial. He wasn't watching her with new suspicion. He kept looking past her, out the small window, scanning the tree line at the far end of the canyon below them, as if expecting something else entirely. The sun finally broke over the high peaks, flooding the canyon with a blinding, golden light that glittered on the fresh snow. It was breathtaking, and in that clear, silent morning, a new sound intruded. A mechanical, sputtering growl. Not one engine. Granger was at the window in an instant. Audrey joined him, peering over his shoulder. Down in the canyon bottom, two men on ATVs were cutting slow, deliberate tracks through the deep snow. They weren't rangers. They weren't search and rescue. They wore dark jackets and jeans, and even from this distance, Audrey could see the hard set of their shoulders. They stopped their machines, the engines idling with a low, threatening rumble that echoed up the stone walls. One of them cupped his hands around his mouth. "Granger." The shout bounced off the cliffs, ugly and out of place. "We know you're up there. Time to settle accounts." Granger's face went pale beneath his tan. All the color drained away, leaving his skin the shade of old paper. The tense, waiting look she'd seen all morning crystallized into pure, cold dread. He wasn't scared of her. He was scared of them. He turned from the window, his movements suddenly urgent. He grabbed a small, empty backpack from a hook and started shoving things into a handful of protein bars from his stash. The canister of no gritty water, a flashlight. He thrust it into Audrey's hands. "There's a fissure," he said, his words coming fast. "In the back of the shack, behind that tarp. It's tight, but it opens to a game trail on the other side of the ridge. Follow it south. It will drop you down near the old ranger station on Willow Creek. It's about 12 miles. He was sending her away. "Alone." "Who are they?" Audrey asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he looked at her, and for the first time, there was no confusion, no distance in his eyes. There was a desperate, clear urgency. "They're not here for you." Then he did something that changed everything. He reached for his rifle, which leaned in the corner by the door, but he didn't point it at her. He didn't even look at it with anger. He checked the chamber with a practiced, weary motion, and then he stepped to the door of the shack. He paused, his hand on the rough wood. He didn't look back. "Just run, and don't stop." He pulled the door open. The brilliant, cold morning sunlight poured in, framing him in gold. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped out into the open. Closing the door firmly behind him, Audrey stood frozen, the pack heavy in her hands. From outside, she heard his boots crunch through the snow, moving away from the shack, toward the edge of the overlook, drawing their attention, giving her a chance. The men below shouted again, their voices angry now. The final action was hers. She turned, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She saw the old canvas tarp he'd mentioned, draped over a recess in the rock wall. She pulled it aside. There was the fissure, a dark, narrow crack in the mountain, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It led into absolute darkness. She took one last look at the warm, terrible little shack, at the cot, the stove, the smiling photograph. Then she slung the pack onto her back, took a breath that tasted of dust and cold stone, and stepped into the dark crack. Behind her, she left the shelter, the mystery, and the man who had saved her life to face whatever was coming for him. The story wasn't over, it was just splitting onto two different trails. 47 hours. That's how long it had been since Audrey saw the boot print filling with ice melt. It felt like a lifetime. Now, she stood under the buzzing fluorescent light of the Sunrise Creek Ranger Station, her legs trembling, not from exhaustion, but from the simple, unbelievable fact of being safe. Her clothes were torn and stained with dirt. Her hair was a wild tangle. Her feet, still in their damp, battered hiking boots, ached with every heartbeat. The hike out from the fissure had been a blur of sheer will. She'd followed Granger's instructions, squeezing through that cold, dark crack in the mountain for what felt like an eternity, her backpack scraping the stone. When she finally emerged, blinking in the sunlight on the other side of the ridge, she found the game trail. It was faint, but it was there. She walked for hours, then for what felt like days, guided only by the weak winter sun and a desperate hope. She slept for a few fitful minutes, curled under a pine tree, the sounds of the forest making her jump at every snap of a twig. She drank the gritty water from the canister without a second thought. She just kept moving south, putting one foot in front of the other, until the trail widened. And then she saw it. The weathered brown roof of the Willow Creek Station. The two rangers inside had been shocked to see her. Her name, Audrey Reynolds, was on a missing person alert that had just gone out that morning. They sat her down at a small formica-topped table that was covered in topographic maps and coffee mug rings. One ranger, a kind-faced woman named Lisa, brought her a thick ceramic mug of hot chocolate. The steam rose, smelling sweet and impossibly normal. The heat from the mug seeped into Audrey's frozen fingers. A feeling so ordinary it made her want to cry. She told her story in pieces, her voice hoarse. The storm, the rock, following the man, the shack. She tried to explain the fear, the photograph, the men on the It came out jumbled, a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The rangers listened patiently, their faces growing more and more serious. When she finished, there was a long silence, broken only by the steady tick-tock of a large, round clock on the wall above a rack of Smokey Bear pamphlets. It was 11:04 a.m. on Thursday, October 19th. Slowly, Audrey reached into the front pocket of the small backpack Granger had given her. She pulled out the only thing she had carried with her from the shack. She hadn't planned to take it. She'd just seen it on the shelf as she turned to leave, and her hand had acted on its own. She placed it gently on the formica table, next to the hot chocolate mug. It was the framed photograph. The glass was now cracked in a fine, spiderweb pattern from being pressed against her back during her desperate scramble through the fissure. The smiling woman, her hair blown by the wind, now looked out through a fractured lens. Ranger Lisa leaned forward, her eyes widening. She didn't touch the picture. She just stared at it, then looked at her colleague, a man named Ben. A silent understanding passed between them. "Audrey," Lisa said gently, "do you know who that is?" Audrey shook her head, a lump forming in her throat. "That's Lena Pearson," Ben said quietly. He walked over to a filing cabinet, its drawers squealing in protest, and pulled out a folder. He placed an old, photocopied missing person poster on the table. The face was the same. Lena Pearson, age 31, last seen hiking in the high lonesome area 5 years ago. The case had gone cold. "And Granger," Audrey whispered. "James Granger," Lisa said, her voice soft. "He was her fiancé. He was the one who reported her missing. He spent months out there searching on his own after the official search was called off. He never really came back, if you know what I mean. He became a bit of a ghost out there. People said he was trouble. But," she trailed off, looking at the cracked photo. "But the trouble was never him." Ben picked up the radio handset from the desk. His voice was calm and official. "Sunrise Creek to County. We have a hiker from the Granger situation. Safe at Willow Creek. She may be a material witness regarding the Pearson disappearance. Requesting sheriff's escort." The words material witness hung in the air. Audrey wrapped her hands tighter around her mug. Outside the station's big window, she saw a tan-colored sheriff's SUV turn off the main road, its tires crunching on the gravel, kicking up a small cloud of dust. It was heading toward the mountains, toward the hidden shack, toward the man who had saved her life and then walked out to face his demons so she could run. She watched the car until it disappeared into the pine trees. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking this new, quiet moment. The storm was over. The immediate fear was gone. But something had changed. Something deep inside her. She wasn't the same woman who had started this hike. That woman believed in plans and spreadsheets and avoiding risks. The woman sitting here now knew that sometimes, the trail vanishes behind you. Sometimes, you have to trust a stranger in the storm. Sometimes, courage isn't about feeling brave, but about putting one foot in front of the other when every instinct tells you to freeze. She had walked out of the mountains with a broken picture and a story she didn't fully understand, but she had walked out on her own 2 feet. The ranger station's door, painted a chipped forest green, was propped open with a stone, letting in a shaft of clean, autumn sunlight. It fell across the floor, warm and real. Audrey took a slow, deep sip of her hot chocolate. It was sweet, and it warmed her all the way down. The journey was over, but her story, she realized, was just beginning to make sense. And sometimes, that's the most important step of all, finding the courage to make sense of the path you've already walked. No matter how broken it seems.